public involvement and decision documents. I want to end the presentation today by providing a couple of projects that I've been involved in and how they were a little different from a typical NEPA process. So as Tess mentioned, I've been with EA for 17 years. A little side note, today is my 17th anniversary with EA. EA is an environmental consulting firm based out of Baltimore, Maryland, which is my home office. The company was established in 1973 as Ecological Analysis Incorporated. This is where the name EA comes from. Despite all of our NEPA work, EA does not stand for environmental assessment in this case. We're a company of more than 600 professionals with 27 offices across the US, and we provide a variety of services to a broad spectrum of clients. We do have a long history with performing NEPA work, which is what we're here to discuss today. EA has more than 30 years of NEPA experience working for federal and private clients across the US. We've been working on the Park Service for more than 2 decades with over 100 projects. And this is where my work is rooted today. I started off my career at EA doing fish sampling at power plants for relicensing work. I then moved into doing ecological risk assessments for the Department of Defense. Then I got my start in NEPA with the DoD. That quickly morphed into NEPA work for the National Park System. And that was more than a dozen years ago, and Park Service NEPA continues to be the bulk of my work today. So just getting started, NEPA is a complex process. Today's presentation, as Tess mentioned, is meant to be a high-level overview of the history, the process, and the basic requirements. There are many other laws and regulations that can and do overlap with NEPA. Some can run concurrent to the NEPA process, while others may need to be a separate process entirely. Some that come to mind that I work with often are the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. There are also state environmental review requirements. We don't have the time to get into all of that today. I would just recommend that other laws and regulations are examined early in your NEPA process to ensure that the processes are not duplicative or in conflict with one another. So a little history behind NEPA. The National Environmental Policy Act was signed into law by President Nixon in 1970. Since its inception, NEPA has required federal agencies to consider environmental impacts of their proposed actions and reasonable alternatives to those actions. NEPA was the first nationwide environmental law in the US. Before NEPA, federal agencies often implemented an action without full consideration of the direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental impacts of an action, and the public involvement was not required. In the simplest terms, NEPA requires analysis of alternatives and public input on the proposed action. It provides decision makers with the ability to make an informed decision. It is important to note that the end result of a NEPA project does not always result in the action with the fewest impacts, but management at least has all of the foreseeable impact information on the action and can make the best decision with that information. NEPA remained largely unchanged until 2020, when the Council on Environmental Quality announced a final rule which would modernize its regulations to streamline the development of infrastructure projects and promote better decision-making by the federal government. The 2020 rulemaking tightened restrictions on the timelines for the NEPA process and the page limits for the document, and that is dependent on the level of NEPA needed. Some additional changes include the following. Agencies would not be required to undertake new scientific and technical research to inform their analyses, though they were not prevented from doing so. Applicants would be allowed to prepare EISs under direction of the lead agency. The definitions of direct, indirect, and cumulative effects were simplified, removing the distinctions among them. And further, the term major federal action was defined as an activity or decision subject to federal control and responsibility. I think it's important to note that major federal action is not truly defined, and it's really up to the lead agency to determine whether or not NEPA is needed. Currently, CEQ is working on revising NEPA's implementing rules. The revisions are noted to restore some of the requirements that were in place prior to the 2020 rulemaking, such as the analysis of direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts specifically. And these regulations are currently under agency review. In the meantime, we're seeing executive orders directing agencies to consider climate change and environmental justice issues in NEPA required project reviews, as well as a presidential memorandum requiring more meaningful consultation with tribal officials for actions that could have tribal implications. Since I mentioned tribal involvement, I wanted to share an environmental assessment that was recently published for public comment. This is the Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve's Backcountry Wilderness Management Plan and EA. The land of Glacier Bay is part of the traditional lands of the Tlingit people. It is obvious from this report that there was a lot of collaboration between the park and the Tlingit people for this document. And I think they did a wonderful job in presenting that in this document. Throughout the document, they provide some language in the Tlingit language, and like you can see just from the table of contents, it is incorporated throughout. They just did a really great job of incorporating those indigenous people in this process, and I think that's important to note. Okay, so let's get into NEPA itself. There are 3 levels of NEPA documentation: a categorical exclusion, sometimes called a CE or a Cat X, environmental assessments, which are EAs, and environmental impact statements, or an EIS. Once an action is defined, the level of documentation must be decided. So we'll just define these on this slide here. A Cat X is appropriate for actions that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the environment. Examples of Cat X's are actions that fall under normal operations, like snow removal or routine vegetation maintenance. Environmental assessments are public documents that provide sufficient evidence and analysis for determining whether to prepare an EIS or a finding of no significant impact. A finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, is a decision document, much like the record of decision for an EIS, and we'll discuss those a little later. An EIS is a detailed written statement required under NEPA when one or more environmental impacts would be significant and mitigation measures cannot reduce the impacts below significant levels. So this is a simple flow chart that depicts the screening process when determining the level of NEPA that should be performed for an action. So once an action is proposed and defined, the proponent will determine if NEPA applies. If it does, and there is a Cat X that applies, no additional analysis is required. Each federal agency has a list of specific categorical exclusions. Occasionally, there might be an extraordinary circumstance for an action. So even if there is an applicable categorical exclusion, an EA or EIS must be prepared. And these extraordinary circumstances are those for which an agency has already determined that further environmental analysis is required for an action. If an action does not fit under a categorical exclusion, an EA or EIS must be prepared unless the action already fits under an existing NEPA document. Typically at this stage, significant impacts can be fairly well predicted. So the agency or the proponent can determine at this point whether an EA or EIS would be required. But there are occasions where new information is obtained during the process of preparing an EA, and an EIS must ultimately be prepared for that action. So we'll go a little bit more on what's required under each. As I noted, each agency has a unique list of categorical exclusions. Some Cat X's require documentations while others do not. And this is dependent on whether the actions will have any level of environmental impacts. Cat X actions typically do not require public outreach, but that is always an option. And if there will be any environmental impacts from the action, agencies will typically notify the public of the action once the Cat X is complete. Environmental assessments, or EAs, are the most common NEPA documentation prepared. Under current regulations, EAs must be completed within 1 year and must be 75 pages or less. A quick note about the page limit. Does not include the cover page, the figures or tabular data. Also, preparers can put some information in appendices as those don't count towards the page limit as well. These hacks are generally not needed. It's just something good to keep in your back pocket if needed. The page limit goals were to get preparers to focus on the important issues that would help management make an informed decision. An example is if all alternatives would affect a resource in the same way, this would not help decide among the alternatives. Therefore, that resource probably does not need to be fully analyzed in the EA. And a note on that is when you're looking at the resources to be analyzed in an environmental assessment or an EIS, those that would be affected the same or wouldn't be affected at all should be presented in a resources considered but dismissed section, just to make note that these were considered, but they would not help towards making a decision. The required content for an EA includes the need for the proposed action, a description of the proposed action and the alternatives, an analysis of the probable environmental impacts of the alternatives, and a list of the agencies and stakeholders consulted during preparation of the EA. EISs are more detailed than EAs. They must be completed within 2 years and must be 150 pages or less. There are circumstances where an action is considered of unusual scope or complexity, and for those projects, the page limit could be extended to 300 pages. Required content of the EIS includes the executive summary, the purpose and need for the proposed action, a description of the alternatives, including a preferred alternative, a description of the baseline environment or the affected environment, an analysis of the probable environmental impacts of a proposed action and the alternatives, and a list of preparers, agency consultation, summary, and other stakeholders consulted. So I wanted to go over some of the content that is similar between EAs and EISs. It is important to remember that an EIS must provide a more detailed analysis, as the impacts on at least one resource will be significant if you're writing an EIS. The purpose of an action is a broad statement of the goals of the action and is posed in terms of the desired outcome. The need for action states the underlying problem or opportunity. For example, the purpose of a road improvement project may be to increase driver safety, but the need is due to damaged sections of the roadway and insufficient drainage that requires a high level of maintenance. I noted before, EAs do not require a purpose statement, but the purpose and need are often intertwined and presented in one statement or one paragraph. The proposed action and alternatives to the action should be adequately described in the document. The proposed action is the initial proposal to address the purpose and need. EAs and EISs must address the no action alternative, which is the current situation or the current management of the resource. There must be a reasonable range of alternatives. And the alternatives retained for analysis should provide different options to consider. And the document should briefly describe the alternatives considered but dismissed. There can be an infinite number of ways to alter an alternative or an element of an alternative, but the alternatives analyzed should be realistically different from one another. In addition, the public comment often brings in ways that the agency could change the alternative. And while all substantive comments should be considered, the minute differences can be addressed in an alternatives considered but dismissed section. And that just documents the agency or the proponents, how they looked at all appropriate alternatives and how they settled on the list that is fully analyzed. The environmental consequences should be an analysis of the effects of the proposed action and the alternatives. The analysis must take a hard look at impacts that alternatives would have on the environment if an alternative were to be implemented. The impacts among the alternatives should be able to be compared for each resource considered, and the analysis should consider all foreseeable impacts, use sound science and the best available information, and make a logical, rational connection between the facts presented and the conclusions drawn. So this slide shows the topics that could be considered under NEPA review, and they include physical, natural, and cultural resources, the human environment, and as well as environmental justice. This list is definitely not exhaustive, and impacts on all resources should be considered during your NEPA process. All right, so we're going to get into the process now. The NEPA process starts with identification of the action. Once defined, the planning team will start scoping. Several of the following steps can be considered during the scoping process, including identification of the issues, refining the action, and developing the alternatives. Once baseline information is gathered, the team can start analyzing the alternatives, identifying mitigation, and describing the impacts. Once the impacts are known, management will select an alternative for implementation, and the team will prepare the decision document. This process appears to be streamlined, but we often need to revisit many of these steps throughout the NEPA process as elements of the alternatives can change, or new information is obtained, or new ideas are explored. So I wanted to highlight the scoping process a bit more. In a perfect world, all of the actions listed on this slide would happen at the beginning of each project, and the planning team would have all the information at the start of the process. But the reality is that NEPA is an iterative process, and there's new information gathered throughout the process. New details of the action may come to light. A new reviewer may have new insight on impacts on a resource, or public comment may bring up concerns that the planning team didn't think of. It's important to be able to be flexible and adaptable during the NEPA process. So public involvement is an important part of the NEPA process. There are different requirements for the different levels of NEPA. As I mentioned, no public outreach is required for a CADX. For EAs, the only time public comments are required is once the EA is finished and published and available for public review. The comment period is open for at least 30 days. And the planning team can determine whether they think a public meeting would be helpful. Public scoping at the beginning of an EA is not required, but it can be helpful. This goes back to what I was saying on the previous slide. Scoping is an information gathering step, and the public often provides helpful feedback. For an EIS, the agency must publish a notice of intent in the Federal Register. This kicks off the scoping period, which is at least 30 days. Once the draft EIS is complete and ready for public review, the agency will publish a notice of availability, and the public will have at least 45 days to provide comments. Again, public meetings are not mandatory, but can be planned if they would be beneficial. So this slide provides what is required under NEPA. The agency or planning team can decide to provide information to the public or ask for comment at any point during the NEPA process. Sometimes, especially if a project is controversial, having additional contact with the public can dispel rumors or ill feelings or help clear up misunderstandings. I wanted to just show some of the recent public outreach that we have done. This photo here shows banners that were created for an open house style meeting. Participants were welcome to come in at any time during the meeting. The park planning team was available to talk with participants, and participants could share ideas, ask questions, and jot thoughts on the flip charts. I always find it important to notify people that providing written comments is really important. That way they are truly considered and the comments are coming in the participants' own words. We create other public outreach materials. On the left here, you see a postcard announcing upcoming public meetings. The newsletter in the middle announced the availability of an EA, as well as the 2 public meetings that were planned. And the newsletter itself just gives a very brief overview of the information that's in the EA. And then on the right here is just the cover page of a presentation that we used for a virtual public meeting. Some project teams also decide to include a presentation during in-person meetings. Some are more formal. Some are just playing in the background on loop. And some meetings actually take official comment or have a Q&A session with a court reporter present, so that all of the spoken comments are entered into the public document. And recently we've been using RTS Story Map. This is a relatively new tool for us that can be used in lieu of a newsletter, but it can also be used to run a virtual public meeting. It's hard to show how this works with stills, but I have the link down here, but basically a story map is just a website and the person can scroll through on their own. It's interactive. You can add additional pictures and then we always provide the link to which a person can use to provide their comment on the project. So the final step for NEPA practitioners is often the decision document, which is a finding of no significant impact for an EA and a record of decision for an EIS. The finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, is a decision document supported by an EA that presents the reasons why an action will not have significant impacts on the human environment. The FONSI constitutes the legal finding that justifies the decision not to prepare an EIS. FONSIs must be available for public review for 30 days prior to making a final determination on whether to prepare an EIS, meaning that the selected action cannot be implemented until after the 30-day period has passed. The FONSI should include identification and description of the selected alternative, including any changes since release of the EA, the rationale for the decision reached, mitigation measures, and the rationale for why implementation of the selected action would not result in significant adverse impacts. An errata sheet is added, and comment responses from public comment can also be included. The errata can be used to fix any errors or small changes to the EA that were noticed since it was published. These changes may have come from additional internal review or may actually be a result of public comment. For National Park Service decision documents, a non-impairment determination is also included. And this is a document that states in writing that in the professional judgment of the decision maker, the action selected will not result in impairment to park resources or values. The non-impairment decision is prepared for the selected action only and must be completed prior to signing the FONSI or ROD. If an action would impair park resources or values, it may not be selected. So this is kind of a last step in verifying that the selected action will not impair park resources. The record of decision, or ROD, is a decision document prepared to substantiate the decision based on an EIS. The agency must wait 30 days between the publication of the FEIS or the final EIS and making a decision. Therefore, the ROD cannot be released earlier than 30 days after publication of the final EIS. The signed ROD must be made available to the public through appropriate notice. And for actions with effects of national concern, a notice of availability must be published in the Federal Register, and notice must be provided to appropriate organizations. Okay, so that was a lot. I wanted to end my presentation by providing a couple of examples of NEPA projects that I've been involved in that were not just run of the mill. The first one was an EIS for Death Valley National Park in California. The Saline Valley Warm Springs area is located in the northwest portion of the park. It's a relatively small area of backcountry. It's approximately 1,000 acres surrounded by wilderness. And that 1,000 acres does not sound like a small area, but considering the park's 4 million acres, this little area is relatively small. And in fact, the park created a management plan for the entire park, but based on public comment, this small area was removed from that overall management plan, and a specific management plan for this small area had to be developed, and that's where we came in. This area in the park can be difficult to reach. It's about 4 hours from park headquarters, and some of that is on rough washboard roads. The Saline Valley Warm Springs area is comprised of 3 distinct areas: Lower, Palm, and Upper Springs. And together it is considered one of the park's developed backcountry campgrounds. Each area has a source spring associated with it. At Lower and Palm Spring, a system of pipes and hoses has been created to divert water from source springs to soaking tubs, showers, dishwashing sinks, and other features. These features are obviously not natural and maintained by the user group. And then the Upper Spring is relatively natural aside from several invasive species that grow there. I just wanted to show some pictures here to kind of orient you and give an idea of the site itself. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see 2 burros there. Burros are brought out to California for mining activities and were just left behind, and they actually did very well on their own. But the burros that live near Saline Valley are often fed by visitors, so they are semi-feral and expect food and often raid campsites. On the bottom left here, this is the Lower Spring area. It's the most developed of the 3 areas within our project area. You can see it's fully developed. They call them soaking tubs. It's basically a small spa and lots of development around it. Top middle is Palm Springs, still developed, but far less so than the Lower Spring. And then bottom middle is the Upper Spring, which is mostly natural. On the top right here, you see where a peace sign has been carved into a foothill. And then on the bottom right, this is some of the, just an example of some of the artwork that is created and left behind in this area. It's very common. So the first soaking tub, not entirely sure when it was constructed, but it was definitely in place by 1947. And then there was subsequent development that occurred between 1965 and 1978. This period of development coincides with strong social movements in American history, including the counterculture movement of the 30s, the beat movement of the 50s, and the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s. And then that was followed by the anti-war, feminist, civil rights, and environmental movements. Clothing optional recreation is common at the springs. And for longtime users of the area, there's a strong sense of community and volunteerism that add to the uniqueness. However, given all of that, this area is also part of the designated homeland for the Timbisha-Shoshone tribe. And the tribe is authorized to use the areas for low impact, ecologically sustainable traditional practices. For the Timbisha, the waters of the warm springs are a source of puha, which is translated into a life force energy. But the development of the area by Euro-Americans degraded this puha and other ethnographic resources. On the right, you can see the list of resources that were analyzed in this EIS. This EIS was actually initiated before the Park Service put out their 2015 NEPA guidelines, which really worked to streamline EAs and EISs. If this document were drafted today, I do believe that some of these resources wouldn't be carried through for full analysis. The reason I wanted to talk about this project is in part due to the uniqueness of the site itself. There are just a lot of dichotomies. We have significant ethnographic resources, as well as historic resources associated with the counterculture movement. Visitors are warned to recreate in all of Death Valley at their own risk, but there's also an ad hoc auto shop at the Warm Springs to aid drivers that may have gotten themselves into trouble. There's a primitive airstrip at the Warm Springs that the National Park Service had to pass regulation on to officially keep open. And this is a Park Service site where the visitors seem to be the main caretakers of the area. But what is really interesting is the way the MPS worked with the user group when it came to developing a management plan. On the pictures on the right, these are actually public meetings. It was designed to be an open house style meeting, but we ended up sitting in a circle and having discussions about the about how the Park Service and the user group might come to a compromise that worked for both of them. Ultimately, the preferred alternative was changed between the draft and final EISs to accommodate some of the concerns of the user group. And I really think this is important to point out because at public meetings, I've heard so many times that from the public, that their comments don't mean anything, that the agency is already has their minds made up, and that in my experience is just simply not the case. So the second project I wanted to speak with might be familiar to many of you. It's the Fire Island Wilderness Breach Management Plan in EIS. So Hurricane Sandy created 3 breaches in the Barrier Island system off the south shore of Long Island, New York. Breaches in barrier islands are typically closed quickly by the Corps, but as this breach was in designated wilderness, the Park Service had to determine the best management for this breach. This wilderness is the only federally designated wilderness area in New York State, and the Otis Pike Fire Island High Dune Wilderness Act directs the National Park Service to manage this area to preserve the wilderness character and to refrain from interfering with natural processes that would typically occur within a barrier island. However, the legislation also states that wilderness breach may be closed if the action is taken to prevent loss of life, flooding, and other severe economic and physical damage to the Great South Bay and surrounding areas. So there was conflicting, not conflicting guidance, but conflicting thoughts there when dealing with the management of a wilderness breach. So the goals of the plan were to ensure the continued integrity of the wilderness character, protect the natural and cultural features of the seashore and its surrounding ecosystems, protect life and manage the risk of economic and physical damage to the surrounding areas. This was the first EIS that was produced following the Park Service 2015 NEPA guidance, which I mentioned for Death Valley, where we're trying to streamline the process and really focus on the important issues that would drive a decision. Fire Island is a very unique place, and the list of affected resources could have been very long, but this list on the right here is what the planning team focused the analysis on. And again, just some photos to kind of orient you. The top left and bottom right photos are aerial photos of the breach, which changed dramatically just in my time in working on this project. The picture on the bottom left shows a person standing at the edge of the breach that just shows how large it was. There were 2 federally listed species in the project area. The top middle is the sea beach amaranth, and the bottom middle is piping plover. And then just the breach itself created a really good place for foraging shorebirds. You can see the terns collected there on the top right. So this project was interesting due to the amount of data that we had to analyze the potential impacts of the alternatives. As I mentioned before, it's our duty to use the best available data, but that data is not typically up to the last minute. But for this project, there was so much ongoing research because the scientists were eager to compare pre and post conditions of the Great South Bay, which separates Long Island from Fire Island. To understand all of the data that we had available and to make it understandable and usable, while still trying to streamline the EIS, the planning team developed a program where we collaborated with more than 35 subject matter experts to gather the most recent data. So much of it was unpublished at the time. And through that effort, we created a technical synthesis report. The report compiled and documented the data, described the current state of the science for the physical and natural resource issues. The report was considered a companion to the EIS and was incorporated by reference. So that kept the EIS simple and readable to the general public while still incorporating the important science. The EIS was noted for its clarity and brevity while providing information needed to understand the issues. So based on the data and the impacts analysis, the NPS selected the alternative, which was no human intervention unless established criteria are exceeded. Under this alternative, the breach was allowed to change under natural processes unless certain criteria were exceeded that might indicate potential future flooding risks. So the breach was allowed to do as nature intended. And I am no longer dialed into the most current information at Fire Island, but I've heard that the breach has closed on its own naturally. And the National Park Service team received the West Henry Wilderness Award for excellence in wilderness stewardship for this document. And that award recognizes significant and long-term contributions to wilderness in the park, the community, and the nation. So that was just kind of a good ending to that project. Okay, so in summary, I just want to reiterate a couple of things. NEPA is a national environmental law with specific requirements, but different agencies approach NEPA differently. In my experience, even within one agency, the NEPA process isn't the same every time. It's important to recognize the required steps and content to ensure a legally defensible document. All efforts should be made to use the best available data, to be transparent, and to notify stakeholders and communities throughout the process. Ultimately, as NEPA practitioners, our job is to present unbiased information on the alternatives and the impacts that might occur from implementing the impacts. This allows management to make an informed decision, and that's really the most important thing. So that is all I had for you today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. And I will turn it back over to Tess.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was an excellent overview and very efficient on time, I must say. Got a lot of information in just a very short period. Again, the questions, you can use the chat. I don't see any quite yet. So if you did try to submit something and it didn't work, go ahead and either try again, or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom to indicate that you'd like to go ahead and unmute, and I will call on you. While we are waiting, one thing that really struck me with our audience today and what we're hearing from you, Anita, is people in the space here may both be a stakeholder in the NEPA process as well as somebody on potentially practicing, depending on what kind of federal action your community may be involved with, or if you are receiving federal money of some kind. And those are kind of two different things, but it also kind of is a helpful perspective to keep in mind. Anita, in your experience working with like community or local stakeholders, what have you experienced in terms of how the most common misconceptions about NEPA, or like what kind of confuses people the most?
The biggest thing is that their comments don't matter. I mean, quite honestly, people come in fired up because they either love the proposal or they hate it. And they don't think that their comments mean anything. And like I said, that's just not the case. I've seen plenty of times where we've altered alternatives based on comments received during public scoping, or even towards the end, like in the Death Valley case. I just think it's important that we iterate that we want to hear from people and that all of the substantive comments are considered. And as somebody who has to read through all of them when they come in, we definitely consider them. It truly is an important part of the process, and one that I don't think enough people take advantage of, especially when things are happening in their community. And I don't know if that's just because we're not getting the word out enough, or time is always an issue. So
right. And I mean, it is difficult to, as on the practitioner side, getting the word out is never easy as well.
I do think that social media helps with that, helps get the word out about even smaller projects, especially, and getting communities. It's just finding the right place and the right media to use to get everybody's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, which is surprising, but also great, and means that usually that means that like everything's really crystal clear. So I think I'm, not seeing too many questions on the sort of wrapping things up side of things. I think I wanted to just mention that if you do have questions, I'm going to go ahead and put 2 emails that you can use to communicate with us. One is smallsystems@syr.edu. If you do find yourself in need of, if you have a specific questions for that relate to a project or relate to an aspect of NEPA, Syracuse University EFC is happy to help direct them to the right person.
I do see a comment from Jamie about the Fire Island breach, and that was an EIS, so that actually ended in a record of decision. And that I'm pretty sure that's still posted up on the Park Service website.
Awesome. And we can also share out some links afterwards. We'll be sure to follow up with folks that attended today, just with further contact information for you. And additionally, we didn't get into seeker, the New York State's environmental review legislation. And I know that that can be confusing for folks that are on the practitioner side. So if you do see yourself engaging with seeker and needing support with that, or require, greater questions beyond the scope of what we presented today, that's also okay. And you can let us know by reaching out via email, or even just replying to your Zoom. Replying to your Zoom information often gets to the right place as well. Going to leave it open for just another minute to see if any other questions come through for Anita while we still have her here. Oh, here's one. In your experience, have you seen the alternatives stand alone, or have you seen alternatives that have been combined to meet the purpose and need of the project?
Yes, we've definitely, throughout the alternatives development process, I've had just a huge number of alternatives that we have to pare down because we have to be reasonable. Many times elements of alternatives will be combined to create one alternative. And it might just be that it was an iteration, like maybe two alternatives were an iteration of one another, and they weren't different enough to warrant analysis of both. So we would combine them. So that is definitely something that happens often, actually, especially with the larger projects or projects that might be, have many elements to them and are just kind of tough to wrangle. So when you're brainstorming, you kind of come up with this broad range, and then you definitely have to take a hard look at it and pare it down a bit.
Sounds like it might take a long time.
It can, yes.
Yeah. I see a question about the relationship between NEPA and seeker, which isn't something we were really going to cover today, but I can point you towards a great resource for that, which is the NEPA handbook from New York State DEC, Chapter 8. Oh no. Send it to everybody. Chapter 8 has a lot of great information. NEPA and seeker do talk to each other, but again, we can't really cover that in a comprehensive way, so it's best to leave it for another time. All right. I'm not seeing many other questions, and in the interest of giving folks 10 minutes back of their day, especially Anita, who was kind enough to join us, I just want to say thanks again to EA Engineering and Science, as well as the Tug Hill Commission for bringing us, continuing to collaborate with us and support answering the questions and concerns of communities in New York State. I hope this was helpful for everybody. The way that we can move forward together is if you keep bringing us your needs and questions, and that helps us know where to plug in best, which is what we like to do here at Syracuse University EFC. Any closing comments, Anita?
I don't. I just want to again thank everybody for their attention today. NEPA is important to all of us. We're all stakeholders, whether it's federal, state land. So just trying to keep plugged in and understand the NEPA process is difficult, but
well worth the effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much.
Thank you.